Thanks for listening to Fluff and Crunch, where we talk about the connection and sometimes disconnect between system, setting, and story in tabletop RPGs. Thanks for joining me today for this episode of Fluff and Crunch. You'll notice that Chris is not here. We have had a bear of a time scheduling our recording sessions over the last couple of months since late summer, because I'm in the Western United States and he's in England, and I had some work scheduling changes and he's had some scheduling changes, and then there's this whole thing called life. So what we are going to do moving forward is our aim is to do a joint episode that will drop every other week. And on the off weeks, I will be doing an episode myself, or maybe I'll bring on somebody else. So today is the first of those. I'm doing an episode by myself. And I'm going to have to get used to talking into a camera by myself, because it's not something I'm used to. So bear with me. And I would really appreciate your feedback, as always, about the content, about the ideas and things that we bring up. But also, if any of you have any suggestions about doing a podcast like this individually while alternating from a production standpoint, I would really appreciate it. I would like to get a better camera and this really crappy webcam that's clipped to the top of my screen. And I know nothing about lighting other than that is a good thing. So any suggestions about those kinds of things, as I do my research myself, I would really appreciate. But all of that aside, as we mentioned in last week's episode, where we talked about how to prepare for a convention game, I mentioned that we would follow this up with an episode about how to actually run convention games, because there's a difference. Obviously, prepping is everything up to the point people start gathering around the table, and running is actually doing it there. But also just some feedback on reflections on the convention that I attended. So the convention I attended is RINCON, which is cute because RINCON, 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 the RINCON mountains surround, well, they don't surround, but they are in the area around Tucson, Arizona, where I live. And so every year, for many, many years, RINCON has been the largest single game-focused convention that takes place in the area. And that just took place here in mid-November, Friday through a Sunday. So for the first time, I played more than I ran. I ran 2 sessions, and I'd mentioned that in our last episode, and I played in 4 separate sessions. And I tried to set aside a little bit of headspace to think about while I was running my sessions and right after, and even while I was playing and then thereafter, to think about, okay, what am I coming away from? After running and playing games at conventions for over 15 years, what have I come away with that I could share that I believe is worthy advice? So here's what I've got, putting aside the preparation. So the first thing I want to focus on, and this is based on me running and me playing, is I believe that when you select what game to run, and this again is something of a preparation piece, but you'll see where I'm going with this for the at the table issue. It's got to be a simple system, or a simpler system, or a system that you can simplify by trimming it down to some core elements that can be easily communicated as rules to people who have not played the thing before. Now that's a planning piece, but that reflects immediately at the table as people gather around and you make available character sheets, and you inevitably, unless it is a system like 5e, or you're running Pathfinder and it's a Pathfinder Society game, and you can virtually be guaranteed that everybody at the table is already familiar with and knows how to play it. In those situations, you just ask, everyone familiar with this game? And then you go from there. But in pretty much every other circumstance, you have to anticipate that you are going to have people at your tables, from a GM perspective, who have not played that game before. And so you have to provide a bit of a rules overview. And this is where a not particularly complicated system, or a system with which you are so familiar that you are able to trim the fat off the thing to make it a mechanically lean experience so that you can present that aspect of the system to the players and explain it to them quickly and do so. This is what I do. I always limit my tables to 5 people, but I make 6 characters. So just in case someone extra shows up, I've got an extra character, but also to provide a little bit of flexibility. When I when I say, okay, now it's time to get started, let's go ahead and choose characters. I will go through and read off after I've said, hey, just remind everybody, hey, this session is about X, Y, and Z. These are the kinds of things like, back of the book kind of description. This is what this session is going to be about. This is what the story is going to be about. Here are the characters I have. And I give the 1 to 2 sentence overview, the 1 sentence character sketch. And then we say, okay, let's go ahead and choose characters. And that's where we start building the group at the table. So the first thing I suggest is, I think I mentioned this last week, is make more characters than you're going to need, but not too many more. Because if you provide several more, then you're just adding to the time, which opens up the door to analysis paralysis when you inevitably have that person or those people who sit down and start analyzing one character. You don't want that. That's a waste of time. So after you've had everyone introduce themselves, hi, I'm such and such, and I'm here to play Blasey Blasey with you. This is why I'm interested. You don't even need that. Just go around the table, get names, and then give your 10-second overview of what this session is going to be about. Then read the 1-sentence character sketches and encourage people to start trading ideas over who wants to play what. After everyone has a character, that's when I take people on, as I call it, a tour of the rules. I use the character sheet as the lens through which my players will view and experience the rules. Because think about it, that's the thing that's sitting in front of them. That they experience the story and the game through the character. So you might as well familiarize them with the rules of the game through their character sheet. So I'll take them on a tour. Here's what this block means. Here's what this block means. Okay, so here are your attributes, and here's what those generally mean. Here's the range of them. Average is this. So now the player's looking to have an idea. All right, my character is good here, weak here, meh, there. Here are the skills, or whatever your system of choice provides. This is how the core mechanic works. This is the core resolution mechanic. And so I spend maybe 5, no more than 10 minutes, absolutely no more. And that includes taking questions. There are things that I'm going to leave off. So deliberately. So the first thing, like I said, everyone says hello, quick session introduction, character introduction and character choice, tour of the system and the core resolution mechanic through the character sheet. And that's it. All right, so that's the first, call it the essential element of running your session. Don't do a rules dump. Don't start explaining all these systems and subsystems and crap like that, because you're going to lose people. Because think about this, the people who have not played the game before have no frame of reference. And when you rattle on about how, like, well, if we have a car chase, it's got blah, blah. Don't. You're going to lose people, and you're going to drain the energy from the table when there is this anticipation, which is a form of energy, before the session starts. People sit down, you give them this overview, you give them their characters, they're about to get involved, and then you just suck the air out of the room by going into a rules dump. Okay. The second thing I suggest having, you need some kind of table aids that are easily passed around. I suggest a map or two, maybe a few maps. If you have a big map, hey, great, that's terrific. If you have a bunch of smaller maps, which is what I use this time around, that's fine as well, because then multiple people can look at them. You have multiple copies and you spread those around the table. I also suggest maybe a half a page rules reference. Don't give them a full page with all kinds of lists and menu items and options and things like that. That, again, is going to lead to analysis paralysis, and it's going to slow the game down a ton. I'd say a half-page rules reference that reiterates in the simplest, bulleted form, this is the core resolution mechanic. For the games that I ran, I used a version of the Aris 2D20 system for a horror story set in 1775 Boston, and a horror story set in 1998 Denver. 2D20, if you're not familiar with it, has a really simple core resolution mechanic. However, I have found that it can be a little bit counterintuitive for people coming from the outside from systems like D20. So having a reference that reminds them, okay, you're going to add an attribute and a skill. You're going to roll 2 dice, and you are not going to add them together. And number of at or beneath is a success. Number of successes determines whether you're successful or not. Okay. So I have that on a half a sheet of paper, and I just have a couple of those laying around the table so that at least my vision of this is as the action comes around to you, Mr. or Mrs. Player who's never played this before, you've got a piece of paper that's sitting between you and the person next to you, and you're like, oh yeah, that's how I do it. Easy, okay? And then a list for 2D20, for example, because momentum spends are so important to giving players some agency and like a creative lever into the story. I have a couple of sample momentum spends. So there it is. That's it. So table aids, I categorize into like, I put into two bins. It's rules, which is that half-page reference. Because honestly, think about it anymore. It's like you go to a work meeting and some idiot is, first off, you go to a work meeting and there's a PowerPoint presentation. You know that it's probably going to be a waste of your time. But when someone covers their slide with text, and you're like, what the hell do I need you here for when you put everything and then they read right off the slide, okay? That sucks the energy out of the presentation. It draws the attention away from the presentation. If you give a player a solid block of text on a piece of paper, there are going to be people at the table who get lost in it. And then that draws them away from the session. It draws them away from the group. It drags the energy level down. So half a sheet of paper for system reference, absolutely core system reference stuff. So there's the one table aid. The other table aid, like I said, is visual aids, which I think if you have, one of the sessions I played in was Call of Cthulhu 7th edition, set in 1760 during the French and Indian War. Good session, actually, really good session. And the guy had, for each of the character sheets, he also had a black and white drawing of a very, very moody, shadowy drawing of each of the characters. So immediately you had this like kind of grizzled dude or whatever in a tri-corner hat and there with a musket. So it's mood setting and the character sheet right there. So those kinds of, you have the game related or game focused table aids, and then you have the story related table aids. For my 1998 haunted house game, I had a map of the haunted house. That's all I needed. I didn't need maps of where the haunted house was. It was on a university campus. That like a university has grown over time and has gobbled up neighborhoods and things like that. And this is one of the last like old structures that the university now has ownership over, and they're going to tear down and replace with like some gaudy building or parking garage or something like that. And the gist of that story was that the characters are all amateur wannabe ghost hunters who decide that they just have to get into this haunted house before it's torn down. And so all I needed was the haunted house. That's it. So I had a upstairs, downstairs of the haunted house I found online, an old mansion, like a Gilded Age mansion, and printed that out. And so I had copies of that so people could pass around. They could look, oh, we should check this room, check that room. It gives them something to hold on to. I'm a big theater of the mind person. I don't do a lot of minis, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't give people something to hold on to and think about to provide some focus. For the 1775 Boston game, I had printed out several maps of various scale of Boston in 1775. So I had the greater Boston area with the peninsula small in the middle. I had Boston Harbor with obviously the peninsula larger. And then I had an even a more blown up version of just showing all the streets and whatnot within Boston on the peninsula itself in 1775. So I had those to pass around so that they could talk about where they're going to go. And when I said, oh, you're starting off in this town, or you're at a farm near Lexington, they at least had something to help build something of a common picture in that theater of the mind. A friend of mine, John, I actually did the episode, a couple of years ago. He and I talked about Twilight 2000, 4th edition. He does a really great job whenever he runs any kind of modern-ish, like within the last 100 years scenario. He does a terrific job of finding pictures of real places, buildings, bridges, people, things like that he just whips out left and right. I don't know where he finds the time to do this, but he does a really good job of finding those things, and it conveys something so that you don't have to spend time describing. And then because he, like me, is primarily running on theater of the mind, which makes it a lot easier because you're not schlepping all these minis and maps and junk like that. You just have papers. I mean, like everything for both my sessions fit in a single folder. But it does, if you can do something to provide some kind of shared foundation for that theater of the mind, that's a good thing. So there's your second piece. Third thing I highly recommend, and I did this, and one of the GMs I played, well, no, two of the GMs I played with, two of the four GMs I played with did this. And I'm not saying it's good because I did it. I'm saying it's good because I believe it's objectively good, and that's why I do it. When you are running a game at a convention, you likely don't know the people with whom you're gaming. So you don't know who's mouthy, who's pushy, who's shy, who is eager to start talking and not stop talking, and who might have a really great idea, but for various reasons is not going to jump in and interrupt over the chatterbox next to them. So what I recommend is you establish this. You say, listen, when we're in initiative time, however initiative time works in your system of choice, obviously that's going to dictate the order in which everyone around the table goes. But what you should do out of initiative time, when you're in, call it like narrative time, say, listen, I'll set the scene. I will describe what you see, what's going on, what's there, so on and so forth. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around the table clockwise, and I'm going to ask everybody, what is your character doing? What is your character looking at? What is your character saying? And I'm going to ask that everyone listen so that everyone can be on the same page. And then what I'll do the next time, whether it's in the same scene, and likely it will be, or another scene, I'll say, and then the next time I will go counterclockwise. So I just do a little bit of variety, but I am very explicit and deliberate about saying, okay, so what is your character doing right now? You're in the farmhouse where the murders took place. You step inside. There's blood and guts and yuck on everywhere. Okay, what are you doing? Okay, so blah blah blah. Okay, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? And then after they, either pair off or start to work or do the things they're going to do, I'll listen for a while. And I try to talk as little as possible, believe it or not. And then I'll say, okay, so here's what you find, here's what you find here. And I provide this report back to everybody and then say, okay, now what are you doing? And I move around counterclockwise. You have to be deliberate and explicit about asking each of the players what their characters are doing, saying, things like that. And I think by stepping into the breach and like taking charge of the table, you also implicitly, you ask everyone to pay attention and to listen to what their fellows are saying so that you don't get this like disorganized, grabastic sort of everyone's running in separate directions. And really you're not playing a game with 4, 5, 6 people. You're as a group, you're playing with a bunch of individuals who are not acting in concert with each other. Everyone is so eager to say what their character is doing alone, but you should encourage them to interact with one another as characters and provide information to the group in such a way that you support and reinforce that. So clockwise, counterclockwise, everybody together. It's really easy, but it makes a huge difference. And the 2 sessions in which I played that did that, the Call of Cthulhu, and then I played Shadow Dark, which was a lot of fun. The GMs generally did that. I also played in a Cyberpunk Red session that only had 4 players and was at a quieter time of the day. We were the first session on Friday afternoon, so the room wasn't very loud. It wasn't very crowded. So the GM had an easier time just kind of moving or, letting people talk as they would. I also played in a Shadowrun. It's the first time I've ever played. Actually, it's the first and last time I will ever have played Shadowrun. I'll come back to that in a minute. I played Shadowrun on Saturday night, and that was during as one might expect, a busier time at the con. Therefore, there were more people in the room, and it was louder. And the GM didn't do that, and the GM had zero control over the table, and it was a train wreck. So, round the table, bring everybody together, ask what they're doing. And then the last piece on that is, for example, in the haunted house episode or story that I ran, I had did I have 6 or 5? I had 6 players. Yeah, I had all 6. And I let another, a friend of mine had shown up at the con. I was like, yeah, sure, you can play. So I had 6 people playing. And the way it worked out, and this was just the way it worked out, is that the players decided that their characters during this investigatory phase before they went into the haunted house, they paired off. So I had 3 pairs of characters that were doing different things, like researching at City Hall, talking to contacts in the local business and like real estate community, poking around the university to try to find out information about this place. I had 3 pairs of characters doing these different things. So after I got this report, like call it their ask, their narrative and character-based ask for like, this is what we're after and this is what we're going to try to find. Then what I did is I thought about it. I looked through my notes. I knew what clues could be found in those different from those different approaches because I'd made the characters and gave them skills and abilities that would kind of point them in those general directions. Then I just went back in whatever order I felt like and provided, okay, so you 2 find this, that, and the third, and you 2 discover this, that, and the third. And if there were roles that they had to do, I took care of those as we went. And then the next time when they acting on that information, they broke off into different pairs to go research in different ways. I responded to them in a different order. So I varied things, but it was always this, what are you doing? And make sure everyone's listening. And now I'm going to listen to them as they talk amongst themselves and look at the maps and such, and then provide their findings. Basically, the same thing went for the 1775 game, although there wasn't a research phase. There was investigatory work that took place at some different specific scenes where all the characters were present at a given scene. But I did more or less the same thing as like, oh, you went into the upstairs room and you're in the main room and you're outside, and I treated it in the same manner. Okay, the other thing I'm going to suggest is that, as I said earlier, don't do a rules dump. Please don't do a rules dump. Do a rules overview, most essential elements of the core resolution mechanic through their character sheet. Don't do a lore dump. Don't do it, okay? Think about Star Wars Episode 4. You have no idea what's happening. You know from television commercials way back when that it's a science fiction movie and there's spaceships and space battles and stuff like that, okay? You sit down in the movie theater and you see the crawl. That's all you have. It's very tight, actually, in terms of like the narrative punch, the weight that crawl provided. It's very tight, and there's actually a lot of information implied in that, but it gets right into it. Don't do a lore dump. That is as life-sucking as the rules dump. And so what happened was I sat down for this Shadowrun game. I was iffy on whether or not I was going to stay at all, but a friend of mine who's in my home group was in it, and the GM said they had an extra slot. I was like, okay, cool. I've actually never played this game. I've read the rules, and I've badmouthed it a lot because I don't like the general idea of the setting. Like, I don't need trolls and cybernetics. I have no need for that, nor interest in it. But I was like, hey, man, con should be cool. Buddy of mine's playing. I'll sit down and play. So the GM, I was the last person to sit, so I got the last character, which was fine. And they were happy that I had that character because they're like, great, we really need that character. It's like, yeah, that's fine. I should have known something was wrong when I looked at the character sheet, which was double-sided and looked more like a 1040 tax form, not the EZ form. I'm serious. It looked like a freaking tax form than a character sheet. I was like, oh, crap, this is this system. But then the GM proceeded to sit, not lying, he read for about 7 or 8 minutes straight. He just read this long explanation of, I'm not kidding, Hong Kong's history from before the Opium Wars through like the year 22 something, which is when the story took place in Shadowrun lore. And I'm sitting there thinking, yep, in 1842, China signed a 155-year lease to lease Hong Kong to the Brits. That's why it went back to the Chinese in 1997. Like, I'm sitting there thinking, and this guy's reading, it's blah, 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 blah. It was nightmarish. If you believe that your story requires the players to have this deep lore knowledge in order to play the story well and enjoy it, you should pick a different story. Because unless you can guarantee that your players show up with enough prior knowledge to interface with your story in the place and at the level that you want them to, your story is not going to work. Because what's going to happen is you're going to read this stupid lore dump and you're going to go on and on and on. You're going to be probably frustrated because the players are actually not going to get all the details and nuance as if they live in the made-up world. They're not going to pick these things up, and they're not going to interact with your story the way that you expect them to, because they don't have all this prior knowledge. If you believe you need to provide all this bulk of prior knowledge to your players at a con, you are running the wrong story. So, couple of reflections. Like I said, I played Shadowrun, I played Cyberpunk Red, played Shadow Dark, and then Call of Cthulhu 7th Edition. And a couple of things thinking about those four GMs. The Shadowrun GM made a huge, like I said, fatal error at the jump by doing this lore dump. And then having, when you're listening to someone explain something technical or something detailed, and whether you know anything about it or not, especially when you don't, there are those tells when you're listening and you're like, you actually don't understand this. I don't believe that he really had a firm grasp on the system. He certainly didn't have a firm enough grasp on the system to explain it well, because his explanations varied as the same general questions came up throughout the 4-hour session. Some of the same questions, especially about combat and skill usage, came up, and he differed, and he couldn't seem to make up his mind. So you have to be certain. You have to know the system, and you have to know the system well enough to know which parts to leave out. And I don't know how else to say this, but it's like you've got to be confident. Because once you start to, how it is when you're talking in front of a group of people, once you start to buckle and internal monologue question yourself, you tend to collapse on yourself. And he didn't necessarily collapse on himself. He did not manage the session as a game very well at all, because it was like this free-for-all of people talking. First off, it was like Attila the Hun, meeting rules as people just climbed all over each other, trying to say this or that or say what they're doing. And I don't think there wasn't anyone at the table, it seemed like, who was like an old hand Shadowrun player. And so nobody could say, oh yeah, I can hook you up with the rules, or that's how this rule works. So he was constantly explaining different parts of the rules, and he just didn't have any sense for how disconnected some of the people at the table were, and how confused some people were about some aspects of the system. And so it turned into a really, and he's a really nice guy and all that stuff, obviously. I will always give a person credit for volunteering to GM, because I know what time it takes to put into it, and you're the one hanging yourself out there, and there's this implicit promise that I'm going to give you fun. So I'm not going to take that away from the guy at all. But it was really a dissatisfying session because it was not well managed. And it seemed like he put all the emphasis in the wrong places, like deep lore details, scant understanding of the system he was running. So there's an error. The guy who ran Shadow Dark had table aids. I have never had this before. He had painted on like 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper. He had painted these, and I don't say this to be offensive, because honestly, I can't draw, I can't paint. I have no graphic art skill whatsoever. God did not give me those skills, nor a foundation in them, rather, to develop anything. But these were paintings of like rooms, like a temple with an idol with flames on the side, a giant skull, these like really like Dungeons and Dragons cartoon type of scenery. and done at about the level of like a sixth or seventh grader. Like it was pretty pedestrian art, but there was something endearing about it. There was something very sincere about it, but it was also kind of endearing because it was like, this is my adventure, and you guys are going into this giant ziggurat, and you're looking for some treasure. I mean, it was like being 13 or 12 or something like that again, and playing first edition D&D, which has its limitations story wise, but these table aids did help. As pedestrian as the art was, they provided a way for all of us to look and say, okay, I'm going to go over here. I'm going to go over there. What's that? You know, simple as it was, it doesn't have to be a masterpiece. And he had maps as well. He also managed initiative well. He didn't manage it in the same way that I do, but he generally did. He actually decided, he just went the same way. And he was like, we're all in initiative all the time, which actually meant that he hand waved how initiative works in Shadow Dark. But it was like, who cares? That's what we did. Nobody had a problem with it, but it was consistent and it was simple. And he made sure, and there's no single way to do this, but he made sure when it was each of our turn that he said, what are you doing? And he did it, you know, he stood, we all sat, and he pointed and he's like, okay, what are you doing? What are you doing? And it was done in such a way that commanded our attention in a pleasant and winsome manner and made everyone else at the table shut up so that we could all hear what each other were saying and know what each other were doing. So simple thing, really simple thing, but it paid off. The Call of Cthulhu game, which was set in Western New York in 1760, during the winter of 1760, during the French and Indian War, as I said, that GM also made sure to prompt everyone for their actions and in such a way that it made it easy for the rest of us to pay attention. So again, that just pays off. Like, take the time to slow the table down a little bit. And if someone gets excited, like there was actually one player at that table. There's a guy who had played in my Achtung Cthulhu game a couple of years ago. I forgot he existed, but I was like, oh, I know that dude. He would get enthusiastic and he would have his character do things that made it clear that he really hadn't been paying attention to what anyone else was saying about what their character's doing. And the GM did a good job of like, wait a minute, such and such said they're doing this and such said they're doing that. So what was your character doing again? You know, it's important as GM to make sure that you have a clear picture of what's going on, but in so doing, you also make sure to the best of your ability that the players have an idea about what everyone else is doing. And so he did that. He did that well. The Cyberpunk Red GM, pretty much the same thing. Again, there were only 4 players in a quiet time of the day, so he had an easier time of that. Something that 3 of my 4 GMs, and I've never seen this before, and I didn't even think about this for myself, although I always let people leave with the character sheets. They've already written all over them. That's not exactly a gift. But all the GMs, or 3 of my 4 GMs, provided everyone with dice. Like, here, take them. As a matter of fact, the Cyberpunk Red GM gave each of us a single metal, like bullet-looking D6. Well, that's cool. It weighs a lot. You can huck it at someone and hurt them. But obviously, a bag of standard RPG dice is like dirt cheap now, and I just thought that was a nice touch. You make sure that everyone at the table has one of the things they absolutely need, but it was just thoughtful. And the Call of Cthulhu guy made sure that we had just the dice that our characters needed. He gave those to us. It was like, yeah, keep the dice. Like, oh, that's kind of cool. I had not thought about that at all. And for 2D20, I could do that. But anyway, so that's a nice touch. So RingCon 2024 was good. I had one bad game, and I will never play Shadowrun again because what I did learn of this system, having now played it, I dislike a ton. And I still think the lore is stupid. The setting is dumb, but whatever. Shadow Dark, I think that Shadow Dark has potential beyond just running what you might have played if you were playing first edition D&D 40 years ago. I think that Shadow Dark could provide a little more story depth than something like you'd see on the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon. but I had fun with it, and the system works and it moves quickly at the table. So that was cool. Cyberpunk Red, I'm a big fan, or I was, is, whatever. Big fan of Cyberpunk 2020. I think Red is not as good. I think Red is a little simpler in some ways. Red doesn't demonstrate any recognition that in the last 30 some odd years, there actually have been some mechanical innovations like metacurrencies that are worth paying attention to. Red is basically Cyberpunk 2020 stripped down, and the lore I just don't find as interesting. So I had fun playing it, but it was like eating a bunch of crappy popcorn at a movie theater. It's kind of fun in the moment, but it's not something you want to do often. So Red was fun for the session. It is not something I will play again. Now, Call of Cthulhu, I'm actually not a super big fan of your traditional like gas lamp era Cthulhu. And I actually am not a huge fan of the percentile system. I don't have a problem with percentile systems. I'm just not super hip on that system. But this 1760 tromping around in the woods and having a Wendigo try to eat us was enough of a departure story-wise from your traditional antiquarian creeping around in New England in the 1920s type of Call of Cthulhu that it made it fresh. And the GM did a good job of managing the table, making sure everyone had a clue what they were hearing from others, and so that everyone could at least harmonize their activities and their actions in such a way that you go, okay, this makes sense. No one's off like wandering off and acting in ways that a character would not do if they knew that the two of the other people in their group were doing something otherwise. And then my games went pretty well. I was pretty happy, given especially the short time frame of me completely rewriting one adventure and whipping up a version of a rule set that didn't exist a week before. That worked out. I think I am definitely going to shelve development of that D12 based horror focused system. If I do anything more with that idea of a one-shot horror game, I am going to take a version of 2D20. I just don't have time in my day to develop yet another system and test the heck out of it when I know that I can nip at the margins of some version of 2D20 and come up with something worth playing. I suggest if you haven't been to a game convention, go. It's fun. You have an opportunity to play lots of things that you otherwise probably wouldn't. You have an opportunity to play with people who will bring ideas, perspectives, behaviors, whatever, some of which may be weird and off-putting, but will definitely, and in the vast majority of cases, be interesting, and you'll learn things, and you'll walk away going, I had never thought of playing in that manner or running in that manner. And so you come away with good ideas. And in that respect, I think you get a little bit of energy for future use. In closing, remember, manage the table well. Make sure that everyone listens when they need to hear things. Make sure that everyone is clear on what each other are doing so that you are clear on what they are doing. Don't lore dump. Don't rules dump. Provide a limited, streamlined rules reference, several copies at the table. Introduce the players to the rules. Make sure everyone is on the same page for the most important core mechanics through the character sheet, so they have the character sheet as a reference point to remember those rules as they look at that little half a page core mechanic summary and they know what to do. Bring pictures and maps, because those help focus people so that you don't have to haul lots of minis and things like that. If you're a hauling minis kind of person, well, great. Then you don't have to worry about theater of mind and you can set all that stuff up. But I typically don't do that and choose a simple system. All right, so I look forward to your comments. I'd love to hear feedback, especially from those of you who have been to cons and run things at cons. Tell me about your best experiences, maybe your best tip that you either learned, thought of, or realized. Share con horror stories. I'm sure we've all got them. So do that, and make sure to like, subscribe, ring the bell, so on and so forth. Join the Discord and weigh in with your conversation. We would love to hear from you. Thanks so much, and have a great day. Thank you, as always, for listening to Fluff and Crunch. You can join our Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast. You can subscribe to the YouTube channel, all through the links in the show notes. Thanks again. Have a great day. We look forward to talking with you.